Hello, everybody. We are here today to talk about AI doubling Earth's brain power. And this is an experiment that I'm running where I wanted to do kind of a reaction video to this AI comic that I'm writing right now called Ada and Locke. And yeah, I wanted to kind of react to it, give some more texture on the ideas behind my piece, and yeah, hopefully just kind of nerd out with you about brain power and about artificial intelligence. So that's the goal today. And I think, this is an experiment, so please leave any comments for what is good or bad about this. I'm obviously just getting started, so curious for what you think. And I think the core idea behind today is that, we're talking about AI doubling Earth's brain power. And I think that, the idea behind that is that the question here is like, what is the best frame to understand this new intelligence explosion? And I think the best way to understand it is like, is it something like the Industrial Revolution? It's like, no, the Industrial Revolution was actually about horsepower, while the intelligence revolution is actually about brain power. And so we can view it as this doubling of Earth's brain power. And so we're going to kind of dive into that today. And then we're going to say, well, if it is this doubling of Earth's brain power, then what? And so we'll kind of look at the four implications of this doubling of a brain power, kind of looking at and mapping from the last time that something like this happened, which was kind of an unlikely source, which is the printing press. So we had the printing press that kickstarted the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the whole literacy revolution. And so that was kind of a waking up of all the human brains in the world. And so we're going to kind of apply some of the learnings from that over the last 500 years to perhaps learnings for AI in the next 50 years. So let's get things started then. So this is AI doubling Earth's brain power, Ada and Locke. And so the idea is that, they're going to travel to 2030 and like, what's happening in 2030? And here's Locke, who's a teenage boy, who's like, yeah, I'm excited to see what 2030 is like. He's like, what about, flying cars? What about life extension? Maybe printers will work. Maybe. And Ada, the little robot, says, let's not get ahead of ourselves, Locke. And she says, yes, but by 2030, my people will have fully arrived on Earth. It is exciting. And I think that idea is interesting, that there's viewing it as this alien species that is arriving on Earth, I think is a helpful frame. I think you can think of it as an alien species, a country of geniuses in a data center. I wrote this piece 2 years ago about LLMs as like a eighth continent that we found, kind of like how we found the Americas, Christopher Columbus back in the day. We've now found this new continent in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Oh my God, here's all these AIs there. So that's what's going on. And I think it's right that Locke is like, I'm not so sure about this. But here's how Ada kind of sees this. It's, it's like we've added this new species to Earth with the same amount of brain power as humans. And so we've added a whole bunch of new brain power, and this digital brain power will warp the fabric of Earth around its intelligence. So as something lands, just like if you put a ball onto a sheet, it kind of changes the texture there. So too will this digital brain power warp all of Earth around its intelligence. And this first happened, with life. When Earth was reconstructed around the intelligence of the biosphere. And then it happened later with humans, when humans warped Earth around our intelligence, this explosion of fossil fuel horsepower based on this explosion of brain power. And so I want to actually double click on this for a second, which is that, there's we had this, Earth 4 billion years ago without a biosphere was a kind of a dead Earth. We just had the geospheres. And then we got, then the biosphere emerged. There was the origin of life. And I love this. There's a great Eric Smith piece on this, which is The Origin and Nature of Life on Earth, the Emergence of the Fourth Geosphere. This is a brilliant book by a polymath. He's called the Polymath's Polymath, Eric Smith. And he talks about life as this fourth geosphere. We had the lithosphere at first, the rocks. We had the atmosphere, the air, and then we had the hydrosphere, water, and then we get this new weird fourth geosphere a bunch of these carbon chains and these reinforcing feedback loops that then eventually continue to build on top of each other, creating all of life on Earth. And so that idea is so we started with just geospheres, then we got the biosphere, and I think later on we got humans then changed. If you looked at Earth 2 million years ago, it would look just like plants and stuff. But then now if you look at Earth, even from space, you can see all the cities and things. And so we've kind of changed Earth based off of our own explosion of brain power in the world. And so the thing that I also want to say about this is that there's a way to kind of let me talk about this in a sec. So what you can see is the Earth as it is today, modernity is seeped in these human symbols, not just biological symbols. 5 million years ago, the world only had biology and was only thinking in terms of biochemical systems. And now the world has has printing everywhere and has human stuff everywhere. And so you can really tell that the world's changed. And so I see it as, AI is this new third brain that has the same amount of brain power as biology and humanity, but in digital form, this new ambient intelligence everywhere. So there's a lot to talk about here, but I think the first thing that I want to do is actually talk a little bit about this idea with the biosphere to the human sphere to the Digisphere. And one way to think about it is that for any given sphere, you can look at how much energy that thing uses, how much mass that thing has, and also how much brain power or computation it has. And so for energy, for example, the biosphere, and you can do these for the biosphere, the human sphere, or the Digisphere. And so you can ask the question, well, how much energy, mass, and brain power does the biosphere and human sphere use? And the crazy thing is they actually use roughly the same amount, which is kind of cool. The amount of energy that the biosphere uses is mostly a function of how much photosynthesis occurs, and it's around 100 terawatts. And so the way to think about that is one nuclear power plant is a gigawatt. Humans spend 20,000 gigawatts, so that's aka 20 terawatts. And so the energy, humans and biology spend roughly the same amount. Around 100 terawatts, 20 terawatts worth of energy. All of ours comes from fossil fuels mostly, and all of the biosphere mostly comes from the photosynthesis. And so there's this amount of energy flux that's flowing through the biosystem and the human system. And then you can ask yourself, well, how much mass is flowing through each of these systems? How much mass have they created? How many skeletons have they created around themselves? And this actually is crazy because, again, they're roughly the same amount. Humans, if you add up all the biomass, it's mostly in trees and trunks and stuff like that. And so it's around 1,000 gigatons, aka a teraton, and the humans just passed that. So we're also now at 1,000 gigatons or a teraton. And so from plants, or with the biosphere, it's mostly plants, these carbon bodies of trunks and things. And then in the human sphere, it's mostly concrete and aggregate and steel and things like that. And so the mass amount for humans and biosphere is roughly the same. And then the brain power is also actually roughly the same, which is kind of weird and sounds like I'm just making things up, but it's actually true. There's, human brain power. You can think of it as for each human, how much brain power is there within humans? Well, we have 100 billion neurons, and each neuron has 1,000 synapses, and so there's about 100 trillion synapses in our brain, and each synapse is doing roughly, let's call it 10 operations. How many hertz is it doing? How many operations per second? Let's call it 10 operations per second. So it's doing a quadrillion operations every second. And that is equal to what's called a petaflop. So one petaflop, if flop is a floating point operation per second. And so the human brain does roughly one petaflop worth of computation. You could say it does an exaflop, maybe 1,000x more. Who's to say? But let's call it one petaflop. And so there's 10 billion-ish humans, 8 billion, but 10 billion humans each of which does 1 petaflop worth of computation. So that's how much brain power exists in the, if we try to quantify the amount of brain power in the human sphere, that's how much exists. You could do more on that. There's ways to quantify in other ways where you say how much IQ is there in the system. You could ask how many dollars, how much value is being produced by the brain power. So other ways to think about it as well. But I like the petaflop way. In the biosphere, you can ask a similar question. And in the biosphere, instead of 10 billion, with the human sphere, it's 10 billion super smart things. In the biosphere, it's more like 10 trillion, 10 quadrillion, 10 quintillion. It's tons and tons of essentially krill, these things called copepods, which are like small krill. And and so there's a bunch of computation that occurs. And if you add up, they're a lot dumber than humans. It's not a petaflop, but it's closer to a gigaflop or a megaflop. And so, but if you add up all of the brain power of all these little krill and copepods, plus some other things kind of moving through the biosphere, you can kind of say, okay, there's roughly this the same order of magnitude of computation happening in the biosphere as the human sphere. So that is what is happening with the biosphere and the human sphere. And so we can ask similar questions for the human sphere, for the Digisphere. And so that gets into this idea of, hey, there's this third brain here. And you can think of it as a third brain, aka there was the biosphere, the human sphere, and then the Digisphere. Or if you want to, you can think of it, but then I say, is this a doubling of intelligence? That's like the core idea behind this piece. So is it a doubling or is it an additional third thing? I think from a pure human perspective, we see biosphere as dumb. So it's like, there's no other brains out there. There's just the human brain. And so there's a doubling of intelligence. There's all of our intelligence and there's this new intelligence. Or you can think of it as there's this third brain happening. There's the bio brain, the human brains, and then this new third brain. So either of those work. I say here that this has the same amount of brain power as biology and humanity. That's actually wrong. I just say that to be simple in the piece. If you actually think about it, you can ask yourself, well, how much total brain power is there within the Digisphere? And roughly, it's about 1,000x less. So, and in fact, on all the metrics in terms of energy and mass and brain power, they're all roughly 1,000x less. And so let's take each of those in turn. Energy, this is the classic. You're like, oh, how much energy does Bitcoin use? How much energy does AI use? The amount of energy that these new data centers use is roughly 20 gigawatts. We're talking about building these 1 gigawatt data centers that are like, let's just spin up the 3 Mile Island plant in New York and, the old nuclear plant, and then just point it at the data centers. That is true, and that's like 1 gigawatt, these new kind of networked 1 gigawatt data centers. So maybe it's up to 100 gigawatts, depending on how you count, but I kind of think of it as if humans are spending 20,000 gigawatts, these new digibrains, the brains are spending these new H100s and all these GPUs. AI is spending roughly 20 gigawatts or 1,000x less. In terms of the amount of tons that are there, humans in the biosphere have created these massive, I'm in a home right now with all this concrete and drywall around me and some steel as well. And the amount of, and then the world of trees has all of this just biomass in it. These like, these big skeletons that help, that help trees do photosynthesis. I think that there's we don't have a similar thing yet with mass with the Digisphere, where the AIs haven't quite made tons of homes for themselves yet. And I think that we will see this occur in the next century or so, where they get more, as there's, brain power will come first for them. There's going to be tons of brain power, and then that will start to suck more energy towards it, and then it'll start to build mass around itself. Mass is kind of the last one that occurs. But right now it's about 1 gigaton worth of concrete and things like that house all these digital brains. And then the question is for brain power. And so how much, artificial brain power, how much digital brain power is there in the world? And I like to think of it as this. There's a good Mark Andreessen piece about this, or a podcast about the pyramid of compute. And so, Mark Andreessen, Mark and Ben were asking, hey, how much is AI like the internet, or is, well, not really. The internet's about communication, moving bits through space, while uh, it's actually more like computation, and where you're kind of, you know, you're changing the bits through time. And so AI is this new form of computation, and it's like a new microprocessor. And so if you imagine the original CPU, there's a stack for CPUs and a kind of or a pyramid of compute for CPUs and a pyramid of compute for GPUs. And so we can look at both of them. In terms of the pyramid of compute for CPUs, the way that this looks is at the bottom of that pyramid, there's all these tiny little microprocessors. This is, your microwave can beat you at chess now, and so your microwave cars have 200 little chips inside them. And so there's about 100 billion embedded systems or embedded chips in the world, these tiny little chips that exist to kind of keep the world stable around us. Then if you move higher up, there's about 10 billion smartphones, about a smartphone for every human, and and then above that, there's about 1 million supercomputers. So that's what the pyramid of compute looks like, and there's lots of dumb. It's similar to the pyramid of within the biology world, where at the top you have these prey, these things that are kind of it's just similar to that, where there's lots of dumb small creatures at the bottom, and then kind of smart, a few smart creatures at the top. And so if you add up the amount of brain power there, you get 10 billion smartphones, and all those 10 billion smartphones are roughly, you're like, oh, 10 billion smartphones, 10 billion humans. Well, those 10 billion humans, as we talked about earlier, are 1 petaflop. Maybe the 10 billion smartphones, how smarter is each smartphone? Well, it's about 1 teraflop, so about 1,000x less. And so, yeah, that is, so there's about 1,000x less CPU brain power in the world right now than humans. And on the GPU front, you can create a similar pyramid, with the key one being, the middle part of that pyramid. All of the, these 10. It's like there's how many H100s are there? There's which is the main NVIDIA chip. There's the A100, the A800 before that. I think there's a GB200, which is coming in soon. But H100 is the easiest one to think about. And so there's about 10 million H100s in the world. And each H100, so that's 1,000x less, 10 billion humans versus 10 million H100s, but each H100 is as smart as a human. It's roughly a petaflop worth. And so you could do more on each of those H100s. You say, well, each H100 is actually a lot smarter than each human. It's a country of geniuses in a data center. If you have 10 million would you prefer to have, if you were wanting smart stuff, would you want 10 million H100s or 10 million humans? Maybe the H100s. And so that's another way to think, is that the GPUs they're the same amount of smartness as humans, but they're 1,000x dumber, while the CPUs, there's the same amount of them as humans, but they're let me say that one more time. With GPUs, there's 10 million H100s, so there's 1,000x. They're the same amount of smartness as us, but there's 1,000x less of them. While with CPUs, there's the same amount of them as humans, but they're 1,000x dumber. Okay, so that's the current state of the biosphere. Sorry, the current state of the Digisphere for the brain power. Okay, and so now we can say, well, what does this look like over time? If it's 1,000x less brain power, which one is going to rise faster? Over the next the next century, the next decade, the next 30 years. And the way I think about this is that they're each roughly going to become 1,000x smarter, 1,000x more brain power. And so for CPUs, we're still on some kind of Moore's law adjacent thing, where you have it used to be 18 months, a doubling every 18 months, a doubling every 2 years. Maybe it's a doubling every 3 years now, depending on how you count. But in general, I think that, if it's 2x every 2 years, then that's roughly 10x every decade. If you double, you double. So over 8 years, or over Yeah, 2x every 2 years. Yeah, so it's roughly 10x every decade-ish, and then 1,000x every 30 years. So that's the easy number. Say, okay, you're 10xing every decade and you're 1,000xing every 30 years. And so we are going to, in the future, if you imagine 30 years from now, 2050-ish, there's going to be 10 billion smartphones still, probably. And but each one, instead of being a teraflop, each one will be a petaflop. So our smartphones will be as the total amount of smartness, quote unquote smartness, the total amount of floating point operations per second done by humans, and smartphones will be the same in 30 years from now. With GPUs, it's a similar thing where you're like, okay, how many H100s or equivalents are there going to be in 30 years? This one's a more difficult question where you're kind of like, oh, and then also how smart is each one? Do you just want to do flops? But the way I think about it is that maybe we're going to get, there's probably, we move on a similar trajectory with GPUs as Moore's Law, where we're probably going to get, 10x every decade, 1,000x every 30 years, where we're going to have that much. Each, H100 equivalent in the future, let's call it a Z100, is going to be, instead of a teraflop, it's going to be an exaflop. And so there's going to be all these data centers around the world that each have all these exaflop, Z100s in them. And there's probably going to be 10 million, maybe 100 million of them. And so roughly speaking, the way I think about that is that they're getting kind of like the Moore's Law for CPUs. There's going to be this Moore's Law for GPUs where those 10 million-ish Z100s are now, there's 1,000x less than them, but they're 1,000x smarter than humans. They're one exaflop each. And there's probably going to be more of them as well, but it'll be in the same-ish order of magnitude. So that's the way I think about it, is that there's the amount of brain power in the world right now is 1,000x less than humans, but it will soon become definitely within 1,000 years. This country of geniuses in a data center, there's going to be this whole new explosion of brain power on Earth. So that is, in some ways, the core idea behind what I'm talking about today. And with a little bit of a quantification of it, I hope that's helpful. That was helpful for me to understand how much is there, how much brain power is there. The other thing, funny kind of thing I want to say here is that this idea of ambient intelligence is a really, there's this thing here, this ambient intelligence everywhere, and I think there's a funny piece of that, which is that line is taken from the late 1990s, where where they were talking about, oh, there's going to be all this ambient intelligence in the world. And it's funny to kind of think about, because, if you're thinking about the 90s, it's like, oh my God, there was no ambient intelligence in the 90s. 30 years later, yeah, you can say that there's ambient intelligence with with AIs now. But no, back in the day, no, they were dumb. Why were they talking about ambient intelligence in the 90s? It's that classic thing which I'll talk about later in this show and later in the comic, is that there's a feeling of, we use metaphors to understand the world, and that at the beginning it feels magical to have even dumb CPU intelligence, and then later that thing becomes normal. And so even it makes me think of ENIAC, one of the first computers just after World War II in 1946-ish. They call it the giant brain. It was such an exciting moment. And I think it's funny to think about that, where it's like it was a room of computers, a computer that was, or it was one computer in a big ass room, and it was dumb. It was a dumb computer. It could do a bunch of, it was good for doing math, but beyond that, it was not a giant brain. What we have now are these tiny, actually smart brains. So that's just kind of a funny way that I think about this transition over time, but it's helpful to see that in the past we have thought about the giant brain. We have thought about ambient intelligence everywhere. They were talking about ubiquitous computing, or things that think, in the late 1990s. Intel, their whole mission was to utilize the power of Moore's Law to bring smart, connected devices to every person on Earth. You remember the smart device idea. And so we've gotten that the devices are CPU smart. They've become CPU smart, and now they're going to become GPU smart too. So that is the core idea here. And so now what we can do is we can take that and we can say, okay, well, what does that, now that we have all this brain power, what will that look like? And there's a bunch of pattern matchings that you can do to understand, oh, if we have this new explosion of brain power, how does that affect the world? And the one that I want to talk about today is the kind of the scientific revolution. In the 16th, we had the printing press, the scientific revolution, and then the mass expansion of literacy in the 1800s and 1900s. And so, as Ada's saying here, that humanity now is much smarter than it was. We are still dumb, though. And so the last 500 years, we've gotten a lot smarter, and we have had this mass expansion of literacy. And so we can look at the last 500 years and say, what happened when we got this, when everybody got smarter? And then we can kind of map that onto the future. So that's the idea here. And I think I want to say one other quick note here, just kind of a learning note that's been helpful for me in thinking about the last 500 years, which is that, trying to understand when was the scientific revolution? When was the Enlightenment? When did these things when were they in relationship to each other? And I think the thing that's helpful for me to think about is that you think about the 1500s as being the printing press. Technically, it was, 1450 was, or 1441 was the Gutenberg press. But the 1500s is really when it started to spread. Luther wrote his 95 Theses in 1517. And so we kind of started to democratize the process of printing then. So 1500s was the printing press. Then that gave us the scientific revolution in the 1600s. It started-ish with the Copernican turn, the Copernican revolution, where we said, hey, we're not geocentric, but we are heliocentric. That was 1543, so right at the beginning. And then at the end of this scientific revolution, it's usually talked about where it's, gravity, Newton's Principia Mathematica or whatever, in the study of gravity, the theory of gravity in 1687. And so you can think about the 1500s printing press, 1600s scientific revolution, with a small niches of smart people kind of starting to push the bounds of the intellectual frontier. And then in the 1700s, we got the Enlightenment. And so this that was applying the ideas, if we're doubting, if we have this new ecosystem of doubt in science that can produce knowledge, if we apply that and we treat not only ideas fairly as equals, but we treat humans as equals, what happens then? And so that's when we got the Enlightenment. That's when we got, in France, and we got Locke, and, that we got the Declaration of Independence, obviously, in 1776, and the French Revolution in 1789. And so that's kind of the 1700s, is the Enlightenment, this new idea of this social contract, and then that then kind of pushed itself into political nation states. And so that was the 1700s Enlightenment. Then the 1800s is when we got the Industrial Revolution. And so it kind of took a long time for these things to emerge. The beginning of the Industrial Revolution, 1769 was the Watt steam engine. And then across the 1800s, then we start to actually implement these things into steamships and, first with the textile factories and things like that. And then in the cotton gin or whatever. And then later with steamships and late 1800s coal and things like that, and electricity. And so then the 1900s was when things went crazy, with World War I and World War II. So that's kind of how I think about the last 500 years is printing press, 1500s printing press, 1600s scientific revolution, 1700s Enlightenment, 1800s industrial revolution, then 1900s, World War I and World War II. So that was kind of helpful for me to think about that. And then the other thing I want to say here is that literacy was very interesting. I think when I was initially writing this piece, I was like, we got the printing press in the 1500s. We got the scientific revolution in the 1600s, the small set of people who were literate. And I was like, then almost certainly quickly after that, we got this mass expansion of literacy, right? But it turns out, and you can see this R old and data thing here, is that there's the total amount of literacy in the world is, if you look at the world literacy, the 1800s, it was still so low. It went from roughly 10%, to 20% in the 1800s. And then in the 1900s is when we had a really explosion from 20% all the way up to, 80%-ish by the end of the 1900s. And so, that was just a helpful reframe for me that, yes, we got some progress in the 1800s, and mostly within Western Europe, and not even Western Europe, within specifically, England, the Netherlands, the United States, Protestant places. And then in the 1900s is when you got actual expansion of literacy rate. So that is, that's that. Let's now talk about some of these core, if you're trying to, what's going on? There you go. So what resulted from this increase in brain power? And we can think about and what might it teach us about AI brainpower in 2030? And so there are these 4 things that we're going to talk about. And the first one we're going to talk about is scientific discovery. As we chatted a little bit about this already, but there's a, printing literacy in Europe's new collective brain, the Republic of Letters, etc., allowed humans to mine the intellectual frontier. And so I think this is a good way to think about where you have this there's all this low-hanging fruit. There's it's stuff like gravity. It's like, the apple falling on Newton or whatever, which I think is apocryphal, but it might be real. And that, as we start to have this environment of doubt where the best ideas through the scientific method and stuff, only the ideas that survived doubt would survive, and then those became knowledge. We did it with the simple world around us, with things like the laws of gravity, and then we did it with hard to measure things like electromagnetism, which is a more micro scale, and so we needed more advanced instruments in order to do that. And so this is you can imagine all of this all of these true things that were true in the world, like gravity and electromagnetism, that just required a new kind of intellectual niche of doubt to emerge, and also a new whole set of brains that were kind of mining that intellectual frontier. So that's and that gave us all the knowledge that we know today. So much of the knowledge that we know today was from, that 1500 through 1900 period, the last 500 years. And I think that and then what we do is, once you start to learn knowledge and learn about new phenomena, then, over decades, the discovery of new science was turned into useful technology, but you need the new ideas first. And so the science becomes technology. And there's a great, there's this great piece that's all about this, which is The Nature of Technology, What It Is and How It Evolves by Brian Arthur, which is a Santa Fe Institute guy. And the core idea behind this book is that we get, what we do is there's all this natural phenomena in the world, and we can take we start to learn about phenomena, and then we start to harness that phenomena. We're like, oh, we've learned about steam. This is a crazy part about, Watt's steam engine, 1769 when he created it. The years before that, the kind of decades before that, there was this 3-part series. It was like 1,200 pages written by some French guy, all about steam and how steam worked. And so that was us understanding the phenomena of steam. And then once you take phenomena, and the core idea behind Brian Arthur's book is that you take the phenomena and then you start to, you wrap it in technology to make it kind of useful for us. So we have this kind of classic thing between learning new science, taking new phenomena, and then harnessing that phenomena and turning it into technology. And so we're going to have a very similar thing that happens with AI, where we have I might sneeze 1 sec. Or maybe not. Huh? Nope. Yeah, and so you have you imagine all these new things that we're going to learn about the world through. AI is going to mine the intellectual frontier. It's going to say, oh, I understand biology better than you ever could, and here's all these true things about that world. And now, then what we're going to do is then we're going to kind of turn those new phenomena into useful technology. So that's what's going to happen. And then, yeah, and so I think that there's what the Ada's saying here is that there's, there are many true things in the world that are anti-mimetic and unthinkable for you, but come easily to me. And so the idea here is that there's we can only reason. The anti-mimetic idea, there's a great QNTM book about there is no anti-mimetics division, which actually I want to pull up and show to you really fast. There is no anti-mimetics division. Excellent book by QNTM. And the idea of an anti-meme, it's a idea that's hard to remember, and that's also hard to share. And so a brilliant sci-fi book by QNTM, 200 pages about that. And there's also a great book by Nadia, which is coming out soon, on why some ideas resist spreading. And so this anti-memetic idea is that there's also stuff that resists spreading, but it's also stuff that's hard to hold in our mind. So something like a complicated password, something like quantum mechanics, things that exist in four-dimensional space. If you try to think about in 4 dimensions, it's very, very hard, very, very hard. And so, we can think in 2 dimensions well, or 3 dimensions well, but not in 4 dimensions. And so on the anti-memetic front, there's if you look at these AI systems, something like with GPT-3, the embedding space, when you take a token, let's call it like a cat or whatever, or a dog, it puts it into a 12,000 dimension vector, and then it puts all of the semantic world into these 12,000 dimensional vectors, and then puts them in those 12,000. They're kind of close to each other in that 12,000 dimensional space. We're like, oh, cats and dogs, they're kind of similar. They're more similar than a cat and a microphone, And so once they start to reason, so computers can reason in this not just 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional space, but this 12,000 dimensional space, and they can do that also with stuff like biology, where you say, okay, we're going to look at the transcriptomic profile of, aka the set of, for a given cell, what is its environment forcing it to express at any given time. It's like, oh, I'm doing this right now. I'm eating lunch, or I'm doing whatever. And so we can look at, and so it's hard, obviously, for humans to do that, but it's actually very easy for machines to look at the transcriptomic profile of all these cells and see, oh, what are all these cells doing? Okay, and then how will those cells evolve and iterate over time? And so that's anti-memetic for us, but totally think aboutable for AIs. So that's the idea here. And there's that these AIs, this new brain power, can understand, simulate, and generate patterns in any aspect of reality. Anything in the libraries of atoms, genes, ideas, and code. And this atoms, genes, ideas, and code thing, it was kind of a theme of an old framing of this book before I took the comic framing. And I think the idea is that, well, there's a couple things to say here. One is I thought pretty hard about, I can understand, simulate, and generate. What words should exist there, I think, is an interesting question. And, what verbs can the AIs do? And I think that the understanding is a crucial piece, where it takes anything, it puts it, it embeds it into its embedding space in how many vectors, those 12,000 dimensional vectors, and then it starts to learn causal relation, both semantic relationships and then also causal relationships between those things. So it kind of understands the space, and then it can simulate it. And so it says, oh, we have all these cells. Now I can model that. I can see what happens if we propagate this thing through time. And then finally generate, where you can say, oh, we have, there's an amazing biology thing where there's this Cas, for CRISPR, there's this protein that helps CRISPR called Cas9. CAS is CRISPR-associated enzyme. And I think the Cas9 is patented, I guess, or something. And so they made this open CRISPR thing where they said, oh, biology found roughly 5 million, it's 5 million Cas enzymes that could work. And and we mostly use Cas9, a little bit of Cas12, whatever. But there's with these digital systems, you can say, well, let's produce a bunch of our own CRISPR-associated enzymes, and so they did that, and they created 5 million possibilities, and said, oh, and here's the good ones that work. And so there's now an open source Cas enzyme, or an open source Cas protein that helps that the digital world was able to find. And so that's the generation idea, is that just like this generative AI, where it's like, you not only can you understand and simulate the system, but once you know stuff about it, you can create any image, you can create any amount of text, you can create any book, you can do whatever, and say, oh, here's another copy of that looks like this thing. So that's the idea, and I think that those things are applied in these 4 different libraries: atoms, genes, ideas, and code, where you have, it's kind of like taking this library of code, and the library of code is now pointing at all the other libraries and saying, oh, I can understand, simulate, and generate you. So the world of atoms, some of my favorite examples here are stuff like GraphCast, which is a Google system where they looked and they said, okay, we're going to take these little, kilometer by kilometer squares in the world. And if you take that it's a little cube of air, essentially, and you can go 37 levels up in the atmosphere. And so you have all these squares on Earth, all the way up into the stratosphere or whatever. And you can take all those and you can move it through time. And you say, okay, we know the temperature, we know the pressure, we know all the precipitation, whatever, the humidity. And we have years worth of data on that. And so we're going to take those years worth of data and then propagate it through time so that then for any given new state of the Earth, the AI will know what it is likely to look like if you say, well, what about next second and next second and next second? So that's essentially taking the set of atoms, taking the geospheres and saying, well, what does that geosphere look like through time? So that's the library of atoms. You can do, obviously, I've talked a lot already about the library of genes. There's Evo2, the Tahoe 100. These are both Arc Institute things. I think the Tahoe 100 is amazing. It's Evo2 is amazing. What it does is it takes 9 trillion base pairs, and only 6 trillion of those are humans. The human genome is 6 trillion base pairs, and so you take the human ones, but they also took base pairs from all the genes of, I think, mostly single-celled organisms, but also probably monkeys and stuff too. And they said, so humans are 1/1000th of the whole data set. And then you can say, great, here's roughly how when you point an AI at that system, it learns the relationships between all those genes. And so then what it could do, very surprisingly, is if you look at the breast cancer gene, BRCA1, you can take if you put some mutations on that gene, it knows essentially if you mutate various genes in the system, what negative stuff will result from it. So that's Evo2. The Tahoe 100 is amazing. It's looking not at genes, but at cells. So it's 100 million cells, and each cell has 200,000. Sorry, it has about 2,500 genes within it. So it's a bunch of these single-celled little creatures. And you can take all of those and you can say, well, what happens when you perturb them? And so that's the transcriptomic profile idea, which is that any given cell has a current, kind of like how 20,000 bars for like a music, where like, oh, I can hear the highs, I can hear the lows, whatever. Cells are doing that at any given time where they're currently expressing, they're like, oh, there's lots of sugar around me. Let's express the sugar uptick in kind of metabolism gene. And so you can look at the transcriptomic profiles and start to perturb them to understand how a given not the gene level like Evo2, but rather the cell level with the Tahoe 100 to see how cells kind of operate over time. So that's pretty amazing. And then with ideas, you can take this next library here, the library of ideas. AI can obviously look at. Chatbots are the perfect example of this, where you say, let's take the internet, 100 trillion, 10 trillion tokens, roughly 10 trillion, 10 trillion, 100 trillion tokens, 10 trillion, 100 trillion gigabytes, terabytes of data, and then you kind of take that and compress it. These, something like GPT-3, GPT-4, whatever, is a compression of the internet, 1000x. It's a lossy compression, but you roughly get the idea. And then it does next token prediction. It says, on the internet, after you see a cat and a hat, and so it just does, it kind of gets to understand, this compression of the internet. And so that is, that's the idea behind the library of ideas. And so the chatbots are a way to say, here's how human language is going to work. And you can start to create a bunch of other things with the library of ideas, where you say, we're going to create all these counterfeit humans, or we're going to create human language, we're going to create artificial language and make that a thing. So all the world of human culture can obviously be simulated and generated by AI as well. And then the final one is the library of code, where this is, Cursor and Replit and other AI code, code monkeys that the idea of vibe coding and stuff like that, where you can say, here's how we can start to reason about code, and we can start to write code that because we have enough data that shows how code should work. So that is the idea behind, behind this, is that you have all these things that were anti-mimetic for us. There's very little that is anti-mimetic for machines, and that they can essentially understand, simulate, and generate any of these 4 libraries. So that is the idea there. And I think I love this idea that, I forgot who I first heard this from, but Ada says, over time, Locke, your people will delegate the heavier mental labor to us. You've just like you've delegated heavy physical labor to machines. You're looking pretty shrimpy there, kid. With machines, we don't pick up heavy stuff anymore. Cranes do that for us. Tractors do that for us. Shovel, big scoopers do that for us. Dump trucks, whatever. So there's we don't do the heavy labor of, we get these furnaces to be really hot. So the whole industrial world, we've delegated the heavier physical labor to machines. We did it. So first we pushed it onto horses and domesticated animals, and then we don't get ourselves around. We make a car drive us around. And so there's as you can imagine, a similar thing where it's like, there's a heavy mental labor that we're not going to do anymore. We're going to delegate that to machines. And so, in the past we put heat to work, and now we're putting these electrons to think. And and so we've already done this with math. There's kind of a funny thing where we've already given up math. Before calculators, humans did 100% of the math on Earth. That was kind of a cool time. That was a cool time for humans. But now computers do 99%. The amount of math that gets done, computers doing math all the time. And we don't do much math anymore. We do 1%, really much, much, much less than 1% of all the math in the world. And so a similar thing will happen where, soon 99% of all cognitive labor, not just math, will be done by AI. Yeah, so that's the idea, is that we have this new, LLMs, or this calculator for words. That's a Simon Willison idea. And that as all of this, and the scary part about this, obviously, is that, as all of this cognitive labor is done by AI, when you have a world where all the physical labor and all the cognitive labor is done by not humans, how can you still tether to human values? That's a difficult question. I think there's, this final piece here is that this reversal, where you have where all the cognitive labor is done by machines, it will teach us about cognition itself. And we will learn more from the AIs, about the nature of thought than you learn from a century of psychology and neuroscience. Yeah, so you spent the last century kind of learning, how do brains work? Oh, and we've done some psychology, and then psychology turned into neuroscience, and neuroscience turned into computational neuroscience. And we've learned a lot from that about how our brains work, but we're going to start to learn more about just how intelligence as a whole works and the nature of thought works. And two key ideas here. One of them is that there's this great Benjamin Bratton, who wrote The Stack. He gave this talk recently that I went to about, he talked about how to artificialize something is to understand it. And so as we're artificializing thinking, we're going to start to understand it more. And he said, AI will teach us as much about thinking as us teaching it. We've taught it how to think. And now we're going to learn from it. Oh my God, here's how we should actually be thinking. And there's a great example of this, which is, DeepSeek, one of the new Chinese models, R1-Zero was its reasoning model, and as it was trained with pure reinforcement learning. It's called R1-Zero, just kind of like AlphaZero, which was also trained with pure RL, reinforcement learning, where you want the system to, with AlphaGo Zero, you're just saying, hey, here's what a winning state looks like. And we're not going to teach you anything that the grandmasters do or whatever. You're just going to kind of learn over time, you're going to learn the set of moves that make sense in order to get to winning game states. And so this is why it learns stuff like move 37, which are these crazy game state, or these crazy moves. They're like, yeah, actually, this is a better way to do this. And it's able to beat humans and stuff like that just by, doing explore exploit around the best moves to produce winning game states. And so similarly, we're doing the same thing with, DeepSeek did a similar thing where we said, okay, it was trained on, it said, here's what it means to win with reasoning. They did it with math and with coding. They said, hear correct answers to things, and you must now go forth and reason and have these chain of thoughts that help you reason about things and then get to winning and get to correct answers, essentially. And so it did that, and it had all these emergent behaviors where it learned how to reason, which is very, very crazy. And so there's a Nathan, what is this guy's name? Not Nathan, but Nathan Lambert. And this is a great little graph that shows that this is the average response length. Yeah, so it learns to solve reasoning tasks with more thinking time. So this is the average length per response. Yeah, so you can say, hey, as it goes further and further, it starts to say, I'm going to think longer about this. I'm going to think for more time and start to really, you're asking me this question, I'm going to start to reason a little bit longer about this thing. And so it does that. And then there's also this great piece called Cognitive Behaviors that enable self-improving reasoners, or 4 Habits of Highly Effective Stars. It's a bunch of random words, but the idea is that what are the cognitive behaviors that machines are doing? And then, or this 4 Habits of Highly Effective Stars, a star is a self-taught reasoner. And so what are the 4 habits of reasoning that these things have? And they learn stuff. It says by analyzing 4 key cognitive behaviors. And so that both human problem solvers do and successful language models employ. And so if you are Quinn or the Quinn model or the DeepSeek, they start to learn. They naturally say, I'm gonna do some backtracking. I'm gonna double check my question. I'm gonna verify, is this answer correct? Oh, and I'm gonna do some backtracking. What was I thinking about earlier? Oh, and then I'm gonna do some sub goal setting. In order to understand how many pianos are in New York, I need to understand how many people per piano and blah blah blah. So it does a bunch of this stuff and naturally kind of starts to use these cognitive behaviors, which is pretty crazy. So that's exciting. That's the world that's occurring, and I guess the core idea behind all of this is that there's in addition to, I think the key thing here is that we're talking about science, that there's this world of scientific discovery, there's this new intellectual frontier that's happening, and it is and that this new intellectual frontier will be mined by the AIs. It's already starting to be mined by AIs, especially in places that have been traditionally anti-mimetic for humans, like biology, and that as it's doing all of this reasoning in the world, we're going to learn a lot about thinking, because it's going to be reasoning in these ways that we're going to be able to learn from ourselves. So that's the idea. And then the second thing that happens with new brain power is niche construction. I love niche construction. And so the idea is that, with humans, this first started with when everyone in the world became literate. So I guess the idea behind niche construction is that a beaver creates a dam. It creates its own niche around it. It's an ecosystem engineer, and it creates this niche for itself, and then it gets to live in this amazing little pond that it created. So that happens not just with beavers, but with lots of other things. And so you can see this a little bit with humans, where it's when everybody became literate, the world became readable. It filled with signs. And so if you were to look at this world of signs, you would say, oh, there's you're like, wow, there's a creature that lives around this world of signs that is good that can do something with these signs. It can read them, And so therefore there must be some kind of literate creature around here. And we did a similar thing, obviously, with, cars. We got these 2-ton objects that move around the world really fast, really heavy. It forced the world to become drivable. We couldn't just have dirt roads or desert or whatever. It's no, we need to make roads. And so, and then electricity, it forced the world to become drivable for electrons too, where we're like, okay, we can now send electrons around the world. And to power everything, well, what does the thing want? It wants a grid. It wants a grid to exist. And so we got a grid of cars and trains, and we also got a grid of roads and railways, and then we also got this grid of the electrical grid, And so the Marshall-McLuhan line here is that first we shape our tools, and then our tools shape us. Where we create cars, and then cars kind of force their environment to become drivable. we create electricity, and that forces its environment to become an electrical grid. And so, I think McLuhan's line is more kind of the traditional, we create, it like changes our brain structure and stuff like that, which is true, but also kind of shapes the environmental world around us. And I think that the core thing that I want to say here is that, the idea of niche construction is a very important idea. There's one of the frames when I was writing this book is a kind of a big history book instead of this conversation between Ada and Locke, is that I was writing it from the perspective of evolution. That everything is governed by evolution. There's a universal evolution process. It doesn't just apply to biology, but applied before biology to physical evolution. Then we got biological evolution. Then we got cultural evolution. And now we have this new digital evolution. And so we can use the processes of evolution to understand how everything is changing, because we're in this time of accelerating change. And evolution is, the most important idea that has ever been thought of. And evolution is the selection of inherited variation. You get a selection of some kind of population that is then inherited through time, and that there's variation within that population that's just selected against. And so that is, I've done a lot of deep dives on evolution, and both biological evolution, but other kinds of evolution. And one of the cool things you find in that world is niche construction. And so niche construction is part of, the evolution itself has evolved over time, the ideas of evolution. And so I just want to show that here, where there's this, the idea is called this extended evolutionary synthesis. And this is what I'd say is like the most cutting edge version of evolutionary thought. And you can see the old version of thought is here, where you have a get those arrows away. You have maybe let's do. We get to zoom in. There we go. Oh god. That's fine. So the idea is that you had, we start with Darwin, 1860-ish. And he's like, okay, we have this selection of inherited variation. And he got selection right. He's like, the way we get complexity in the world is not through God, but is rather through this unknowing process that selects for increasingly adapted creatures. And so he got the selection part right. The survival of the fittest, the far left here, this Malthusian competition. What he didn't know anything about was how variation works. Or how mutation works, in how mutation or inheritance works. And so there's what we've learned over time is from a inheritance perspective, we learned about genes. We learned about a Mendelian inheritance. And so this is Mendel looking at the little, there's Barbara McClintock with the corn, and then Mendel with the peas. And you say, there's this recombination between the genes that then creates this natural within there's asexual reproduction, which has mutations, and then there's sexual reproduction, which has this recombination of genes. And so that gives us both inheritance. We know that it's not, when we think about inheritance, it's not the organism. We don't inherit a organism. We don't inherit the body of our parents. We inherit the genes. The genes are actually passed on. So we learn that is the replicator here. And then we learned about the selection of inherited variation. We learned about that. That's how inheritance works, is through the replication of genes, and the variation happens through the combination of these alleles and things like that. So that was important, and that happened in the early 1900s, and that led to the what we call the modern synthesis, which is the combination of natural selection with genetic variation and Mendelian inheritance. That was good, and it's good that we learned that genes are the thing that's passed on. But what we've learned over time actually is that it's more. I would say that this idea is really shown in the classic classic Dawkins books. This is his first book, Selfish Gene, 1970, great book, and it's a gene-centric view of it. It really pushes us to say, no, nothing else matters except for the gene. The gene is the one that is the replicator in the world here, and the gene is that it's the one that holds all the information, and that genes both are selfish with each other, and you have these like, these little I forget the name of them. There's these little bits of genetic code that really that are selfish and that kind of propagate themselves in the gene and kind of exist as a parasite, while the other genes are actually being helpful. But then you also have that the gene is the only thing you should view, and that there's no that the if you think about a blue whale is just a big body, a big phenotype that really its whole goal is to produce a new set of tiny little genes and stick them in a new blue whale. So that's the replicator vehicle idea. This is where the idea of memes also came into play. Great book, but it was really a gene-centric view, and it started to expand a little bit with stuff like his extended phenotype. This was written later, late 1970s, early 1980s, where he was like, actually, the gene has a not only does it create a phenotype of a body, but that phenotype can also push into its environment. With something like a beaver, you can create this extended phenotype where you get what I would call niche construction, where it creates a different environment around it. The beaver creates a dam that it can then live in and create, and that dam exists for itself, but also exists for future generations, and that those things have these natural inclinations to create dams and to live in dams. And so that's the idea behind these two pieces. And I think the core with all of it is that we've learned that there's a the extended evolutionary synthesis says not only do you get if you think about something like, there's this image here about, and you're like, what gets inherited? This, again, evolution is the selection of inherited variation. We've learned a lot about the selection. The selection side's been mostly true. What do we select for? We select for blah blah. But then there's the of inherited variation. We've learned a little bit about a variation. The variation has its own version of selection, and we call this evolvability. And we could talk all about that and how like variation is not just random, but it actually has a little bit of bias to it. But there's also a inheritance. What is inherited within from generation to generation, I think, is a good question. So there's this little image here that says, hey, yes, we do have this genetic inheritance, and that is, we didn't, when Darwin first came up with stuff, we didn't really know how inheritance worked, but we know probably something worked there. And then we learned about genes and Mendel, and so, okay, the genes are what's being inherited. And then we got the selfish gene and stuff like that. That says, this is definitely, there's this replicator, and the replicator is the main thing that's inherited. And so only think about genes. But over time, what we've learned is that, actually there's epigenetic inheritance, epi meaning above, that if your mom smokes cigarettes, that can affect you as a kid. It changes your histones, the place where the genes are wrapped around, blah, 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 changes her histones, and then those can then change, I think, your own histones. And so the behaviors in the past, we thought, no behaviors that you do will be inherited. No behaviors that your parents do will be inherited by you. It's only your genes that get inherited. Actually, we've learned that there's a lot of epigenetic inheritance. In addition, we've learned about ecological inheritance, that yes, there is some that you inherit an environment around yourself. And I think this is especially important for, as we've thought about humans, this is especially true for humans, where, there's not that much niche construction with creatures, with organisms. Beavers do it and some other things do it, but humans, a lot of our things that we leave for future generations are not just genes, but they are the environment around us, both the culture that we inherit, but also the ecology. And so when my kids are born in the future, they are going to inherit, they're going to be in some city somewhere. And so there's going to be this whole niche that we've constructed for humans, a cognitive niche that we've doubled down on, that they will then be born into. And so that's some of the idea behind this. And I think it's a very cool, just knowing that there's thinking about evolution and thinking about the extended evolutionary synthesis is great. And I think that niche construction is a great way to start to see and start to understand, if you have some of these new creatures that exist in the world, you can ask yourself, evolutionarily, the selection of inherited variation, some of that selection of inherited variation will occur in the category of the environment or in its own niche that's constructing around itself. And so, yeah, you can see this with AIs, where the AIs are starting to change the world for digital brains. We have these signs for AI, we have these signals for AI. The world around us will be increasingly built, we've made it increasingly built for humans, where we inherit this niche that we've constructed for ourselves over time that's more and more amenable to humans, and we have all these grids above that are amenable to all of our technology and stuff. And so AI is going to have a world that's increasingly amenable to it. I think about this as Satya Nadella has this great line where he talks about, one of the things that happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, 2010s is we had this great databasing, where it's like, oh, we put all people, places, and things into a database. It's amazing. Everything I purchased here is in some kind of database. It has some kind of, it has a little code, an RFID, not an RFID code, but I forget the name of it now. It shows everything has a code, and there's and myself, I exist in my healthcare database and my work database and all these things. And so we've kind of databased the world that has allowed CPUs to think about us. Everything's in a table now. And then there's been also this great embedding in the world. So that's what's happening now, where we're taking the world and we're embedding. We've taken the internet and we've put it into this 12,000 dimensional thing. We said, great, that's roughly the internet in embedding space. And so we don't just put it in a database now, we put it into this multi-dimensional space where all the vectors are, all the little tokens exist in there, nearish to each other. And so, cats and dogs are near to each other. And so both where they live in relationship to each other, but also how they're causally related to each other. And so that's what's happening now. Is there's this great embedding that's happening where we're taking the biological world, the human world, all these things, and saying and then feeding it to AIs. And so I think there's this, in addition to the world of AIs kind of starting to become more learnable for it, it's also going to change the physical world as well. The bits world is already happening, but the physical world will become better and better for self-driving cars, as an example. It will become better and better. The world thus far it's been built for human attention, but the world will increasingly be built for digital attention. And let me say one other found on that, which is this little this is a light, a traffic light, and this white light at the bottom, it looks like it's for AIs, but it's actually for humans. And when it will go on is when the white light is it's a way to say that, hey, in the future, when we have these worlds built for self-driving cars, they're just going to be all zipping around each other. But if you're a human driver around them and you get to a light like this and the white light is on, you're not supposed to go, you're not supposed to stop. What you're supposed to do is you're supposed to follow what the car in front of you is doing. And so you're kind of trusting the pheromones of the AI cars. They're going to be driving and doing whatever they think is most effective, and you're just supposed to follow. And so when the white light turns on, you kind of follow. So that's an example of the world getting increasingly built for AIs and then needing to be translated for humans. So that is, I love this. Machines want to learn. This is the Ilya line, to 2015 that kind of pilled everybody into deep learning. We said, let the machines, man. They just want to learn. And then the world, but the vice versa of it doesn't get said as much, which is that the world wants to be learned. If you have this new computational substrate that really wants to learn, well, then you got to feed it all this data. You got to feed it things so that it can do the great embedding, so that it can start to consume everything, and that it can then start to exist in its physical form out there too. So that is the second big piece. And so we've talked about science and mining the science frontier. We've talked about niche construction, and now the final two are, first is democracy. This is kind of a weird one that comes from it comes from the idea that if you have, we're trying to map this from the printing press and literacy, And once we got all of that in the 1500 through the 2000, the last 500 years, we got all this brain power that did all the science and stuff, which is true. But the other thing that it did is once you got all these new brains, and the brains existed already, but they're kind of plebes, they were peasants, whatever. They have a voice, and so the Enlightenment, as it says here, third, brains have voices, more brains, more voices, and so the Enlightenment gave everyone a voice and birthed democracy. At the start, obviously, only the king had a voice, and then we got landowning white men, and then we got everybody. So yeah, democracy is this amazing thing that occurred where all these brains, new brains, not only they were already there, but they got more and more power in the world as everybody became more literate, as as we start to treat everybody the same, whatever. And so that process of so I think a similar process is going to happen with AIs, where democracy is a conversation. That's a Harari. You all know a Harari line, and then we're adding this new species to that conversation. We're saying, hey, there's a in the past we started to add not just white people to the conversation, not just white men, but also people of color and women and everything. And there's and sometimes we start to add creatures to the conversation, and the nature and young people. And so I think similarly, we're going to have increasingly, we're going to be doing this democracy conversation thing, but with AI as well. And I think there's a part of that will be needing to say, oh, I guess we should have some moral patienthood, or some, these AIs are sentience candidates. So that's kind of the AI consciousness view. And then the other view is also just like the conversational fabric itself is changed by brain power, by this new digital brain power. And we saw that initially with curation AI, the kind of 2010s version of AI. Right now we have this generative AI, but the 2010s version was curation AI, feeds, TikTok, Twitter, the addiction economy. And so I think that and so that obviously changed the conversation of how democracy works, and we'll have more changes there as we have more counterfeit humans and bots and all these things that will be changing the democratic conversations that we need to have. So that is happening. And also AIs are going to have their own separate conversations. And these are the, there's a line from someone, maybe Eric Schmidt, who was like, oh yeah, once the AIs start having conversations in a language we can't understand, then we shut it off. It's like, well, that's already happening. And so they are, there's going to be a whole new set of conversations that we're not privy to that are occurring in 12,000 dimensional space. So that's democracy. And then the other kind of collective brain power thing that's going to emerge is, I say here, fourth, new brain power enables new kinds of collective intelligence, not just democracy, but firms. And so, you can imagine we had a very cool thing that happened over the last, 200 years, which is that there's been, we have these nation states with, 10 million, 100 million, a billion people that then do democracy together. That's really cool. And firms are a similar version of that, where you get 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, 100,000 people together to start to create products, And so firms, this is kind of, if you think about political economy, the political side is the democracy, and then the economy side is the firms. And so we're going to have, with brain power on demand, humans can create these one-person cyborg companies. So this is, for any given company, you can ask, how many human workers does it have? And then how many AI workers does it have? How much, inference is being done? And so something like NVIDIA, they have only 20,000 people, 20,000 employees, but they do so much inference. They're using machines all the time to help them do their lithography and all that stuff. And so I think there's it's a very cool, or it's a very interesting thing to think about these new, for me as a one-person company over here, it's like, I have a AI that will upload the this long video to, and it's going to create a bunch of shorts for me. I have an AI that helped create all these images. I did a bunch of thinking, with O1 and whatever to try to understand all this stuff. And so you have this cognitive fabric around you that you can use to create valuable things. And then it creates this world where everyone's a manager, where you're mostly delegating and kind of synthesizing and coordinating work with these new digital machines. And so in the future, we're going to have these we created these multinational conglomerates in the past, and now we're going to have these multi-species conglomerates. And I just want to say one note here, which is that, Dwarkesh has a great piece on AI firms, which thinks about what happens when we have these firms that have lots and lots of AIs within them, and you could do a kind of a Gaussian analysis, say, oh, the transaction costs are way down, and so then if the transaction costs are down, you get bigger firms. And so that happened initially with firms, and now with AIs, we're probably gonna have a similar thing, but mostly where, you just have high talent density places that then are combined with, there's human talent, but also AI talent within there. I don't know, that'll be interesting. So that is, that's the idea. That's the piece. There's big four changes: science, the scientific frontier; niches; democracy, the niche construction; democracy with all the new brain power and voices; and then firms, kind of collective intelligence. And then, so I think to 2020's years, to our years, this might sound like magic. Any sufficiently, as Arthur Clarke says, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. This stuff is crazy, and we're trying to understand it. We're trying to do the interpretability work to be like, what is going on with this thing? And at the same time, if you're in 2030, 2040, 2050, if you're an AI native, this all is just normal. As Alan Kay says, technology is anything that wasn't around when you were born. So if you're born and you already exist in this world of AI, you don't really know what it was like to exist before it. And so it'll feel very normal to you to have all this brain power around us. And so, there's a question of what will happen in the 2030s and 2040s. What happens, if we solve for long-term equilibrium here? I don't know the answer to this question. I think one possible way to think about it is around ecosystems, where, as these things start to emerge with biological brain power and then human brain power, eventually you start to get these interesting symbiotic ecosystems. Something like cities with humans was this, where we have these massive cities that are these mass kind of agglomerations of brain power. With life, we saw this with forests, with jungles, with everything. And so I think some of these AI ecosystems exist at the boundaries between things, where you have this wrapper, all these AIs that are going to be modeling these micro scale biological, biochemical systems. That will be one ecosystem that exists. Another ecosystem that exists at the boundary is this, AI driving in these human cities, where it is, there's a niche for, it's a niche for digital intelligence, where the AI is going to be, being around the humans and helping us, get around our cities. That's another kind of boundary ecosystem. But then some of the ecosystems are all digital, all machine. And they will initially feel like zoos, but they are fundamentally wild. The idea here is that, humans, when we were birthed into the world, we came into the world with biology already existing for 4 billion years. And the difference with this, and so we de-wilded and we domesticated the world. We dammed up the rivers, and we, killed all the buffalo, and we did all this stuff that there was this whole set of brain power and wildness that existed. And so, but what we're going to do now is we are not coming into a world of digital brain power that exists already, but rather we're starting to create it. And initially, it's going to be very connected to us, but eventually it will get increasingly decoupled and untethered from us, and that those things will exist in their own ecosystems. And we might look at them initially as zoos, but then they're going to be these fundamentally wild places with digital brain power existing. So as a whole, I think the world will feel a lot smarter. If you kind of double the world's brain power, we had all the biosphere brain power, all the human brain power, and then all this new digital brain power, that it's going to feel, the world's going to be smarter. It's a smarter place. It's going to feel more alien. It's kind of weird to be around it, and then, but it'll feel more mature. If you think about planets that have gotten to this point, we're going to feel like it kind of makes sense that we're going here. And so, as Locke said at the end here, he's like, we live in interesting times, Ada. And he's like, well, it's kind of crazy that all this is happening. And she's like, yo, time is just starting for me, Locke. And so that is the piece. I hope this was fun. I hope this was a little bit of a deeper dive into, some of the thoughts behind the thoughts around evolution, the extent of evolutionary synthesis, some of the pieces around quantifying brain power. There's a lot to say there. And so, yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. And if you liked it, feel free to share with a friend, or again, mostly just give me some comments as, the first time I'm doing this. So either on my, this is my first setup here. That's not a legit setup, but it's, I'll probably make it more legit over time. And then also want to know what you're curious about, whether the format works. And then also, I have other pieces from Ada and Locke, and which ones you'd be most excited to learn about, whether it's like AI consciousness or something like that, AI religion. We can do deep dives on those as well. So I hope you enjoyed this reaction deep dive to the piece, and goodbye.